The torch burned low, spitting tiny embers into the wind. Shadows swayed along the carved limestone pillars, their shapes twisting until the animals etched into the stone seemed to shift under the flicker. Foxes leaping, serpents curling, vultures spreading their wings. Beyond the stone ring, the Anatolian night lay heavy and cold, the stars sharp as blades in the sky. The smell of wet earth clung to the air, mixed with something sweeter, something human. The musk of bodies warmed by movement, breath, and anticipation. A hand emerged from the dark, thin fingers stained with ochre, pressing against the flank of a stone lion. The touch was not casual. It lingered, almost reverent, before sliding downward, tracing the ancient grooves. Across the ring, other shapes began to appear from behind the pillars. Cloaked figures stepping silently into the open, each carrying something different. A bundle of animal skins, a polished stone bowl, a narrow-necked jar glistening with dark liquid that caught the torchlight like molten amber. Their footsteps crunched softly against the packed earth, deliberate, measured, as if following a rhythm older than the walls themselves. Somewhere beyond the circle, a drum began, low, distant, like a heartbeat muffled beneath layers of stone. One beat, two, then a pause. The sound seemed to press into the ribs of those gathered, each thud syncing with their own pulse. Eyes caught eyes in the firelight, some wide with fear, others glittering with an anticipation they dared not voice. Near the center, a tall figure lowered his hood. His hair was matted with clay, his face painted in streaks of black and white that blurred the line between man and spirit. In his hands, he held a carved antler, its tips sharpened to delicate points. The torchlight shimmered along its length, catching every nick, every faint trace of red in the grooves. He raised it slowly, as if in offering to something unseen above, and the circle grew still. From the shadows came a faint sound. Not the drum, not the wind, but the intake of breath, sharp and sudden. Someone had stepped too close to the edge of the light, revealing bare skin, marked with swirling patterns in red pigment. The designs were not random. They moved in spirals and interlocking curves that seemed to pull the eye inward, into a center that was almost hypnotic. The drum fell silent. The night seemed to listen. The tall figure's lips moved, though no words carried. Just a low humming tone that trembled through the pillars. And then, as the hum deepened, a second sound joined it. The unmistakable creak of stone shifting under weight. Something, or someone, was moving in the shadows of a place no one had entered in generations. What waited beyond that darkness was not written in any carving, not passed in any tale. Yet every person in that ring seemed to know they were standing at the edge of something forbidden. Long before the first written word, before cities rose from the dust and kings carved their names into stone, there was this hill in southeastern Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe, the pot-belly hill. From the outside, it seemed like nothing more than a mound of earth, wind-scoured and quiet under the endless sky. But beneath that soil lay the oldest known temple in the world, a place raised not by farmers but by hunters, for purposes no scripture dared preserve. The year was somewhere around 9600 BC. The Ice Age had ended and the world was warming, reshaping itself into something humans could inhabit more easily. Great herds still moved across the plains, gazelle, aurochs, wild asses, and with them came predators, wolves, lions, leopards. This was not yet the age of villages or domesticated fields. People moved in bands following the seasons, their lives tied to the migrations of the animals they hunted. And yet, here on this limestone ridge, they gathered for something far beyond survival. The stones themselves tell the first part of the story. Massive T-shaped pillars, each weighing tons, arranged in perfect circles. Their surfaces carved with foxes in mid-leap, cranes with sharp beaks, coiling snakes, and vultures poised as if about to strike. These were not mere decorations. Each animal held meaning to the people who came here. The fox was the messenger between worlds, the snake, a keeper of hidden power, the vulture, a gatekeeper of the dead. To move these stones, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people would have been required. They had no metal tools, no wheels, yet they shaped and placed these monoliths with precision. It was an effort far greater than anything needed for shelter or food, which means only one thing. The rituals performed here were worth more to them than either. What we know of their beliefs comes not from writing, there was none, but from archaeology and the patterns etched into the earth. Some circles were buried intentionally, as if sealing away their purpose for future generations. Others contain strange artifacts, limestone basins, flint blades worn smooth by use, and fragments of human bone mixed with those of animals. The bones tell a troubling truth. Some were marked by cuts, not from hunting, but from deliberate ritual activity. And then there are the carvings that avoid easy explanation. Two figures intertwined it, their bodies stylized, yet unmistakably human. Hands resting on thighs, legs bent in mirrored positions, heads tilted toward one another as if sharing something too intimate to speak aloud. These images are rare among the flood of animal depictions, but when they appear, they are deliberate. The archaeologists who uncovered them found no signs of habitation nearby. No hearths, no refuse pits, suggesting people did not live here. They came only to perform. Why they performed is harder to grasp. Across the world, in later civilizations, fertility rites became common. Acts meant to ensure the abundance of crops or the health of herds. But here, before farming even began, such acts may have been tied to something older, something that bound the survival of the group to forces beyond nature. Sexuality, in that context, was not private. It was a public, sacred exchange between people and the unseen powers they worshipped. At Göbekli Tepe, the temple was the stage, and the night was the curtain. As the sun fell, the wind cooled the stone, and the carved animals seemed to come alive under torchlight. Participants would prepare themselves not in hidden chambers, but in open ritual space, surrounded by the watchful shapes of beasts that had stalked them in the wild. Every sound, the scrape of flint, the hiss of poured liquid, the shuffle of bare feet over packed earth, was amplified by the circular walls. What took place in that ring was never recorded, but traces remain. Residues of fermented drink clinging to stone vessels, pigments ground to a fine powder, animal skins cut and shaped into garments unlike any used for hunting. All of it hints at nights that were less about worshipping a god in silence and more about summoning something through rhythm, movement, and the bodies of those willing to offer themselves. By the time the figures in the torchlight of our opening moment stepped forward, they were not merely people. They had become the living instruments of a rite older than memory. And somewhere, in the dark, beyond the circle, the reason for their gathering waited. The drum began again, low and steady, as the first of the participants entered the ring. They did not walk together. Each approached from a different gap in the stone wall, their movements timed, as if the path they took was part of the ritual itself. The first was a woman with hair plaited tight against her skull, beads of carved bone threaded along the braids so that they clicked softly when she moved. Her eyes were dark and unblinking, her skin marked with faint spirals drawn in red ochre from collarbone to the hollow between her breasts. She carried a vessel made of polished basalt, so black it seemed to drink the firelight. Inside, the liquid sloshed thickly. The smell, sharp and fermented, drifted into the night. She stopped at the foot of one of the tallest pillars and knelt, lowering the vessel to the earth, as if presenting it to the carved fox that crouched above her head. From the opposite side came a man draped in animal hides, the fur still matted with dried blood. The hide was not sewn into a garment. Instead, It was wrapped loosely, the head of the animal resting over his shoulder so that its empty sockets peered at the circle. His bare legs were streaked with ash, and in one hand he held a bundle of reed stalks tipped with feathers. As he moved, he brushed the feathers against the pillars, leaving faint smears of pigment along the carved vultures. Behind him came another, younger, his body lean and tense, his face painted with a single black line from brow to chin. In his hand was something more troubling, a length of sinew, plaited into a cord, with small bones threaded along its length like charms. The bones rattled faintly with each step, the sound barely audible over the drum. He did not look at the others. His eyes stayed fixed on the center of the ring, where the tall figure from earlier still stood with the antler raised. Around the edges, more figures gathered. They did not all wear paint. Some were bare, their skin marked only by scars or by the natural patterns of sun and wind. Others wore layers of woven grass and leather strips, the garments loose enough to slip away at a touch. No one spoke. The only voices were the drum and the soft hiss of torches. A second rhythm began, this one made by hands striking hollow logs placed along the inner wall. The sound was deeper, more resonant, and it answered the drum beat like a second heartbeat in the body of the temple. Slowly, the gathered figures began to move, circling the center in loose, unbroken steps. Their feet shifted in dust, their shadows stretching and collapsing over the animal carvings. It was here, in the slow, deliberate pacing of their bodies, that the tension began to rise. Each movement was deliberate, choreographed not for beauty, but for purpose. They would brush past one another, hands lingering a moment longer than necessary, heads turning so that eyes met in the flickering light. The tall figure lowered the antler and planted it in the earth, the sharpened tips pointing toward the sky. He placed both hands flat against it and leaned forward, whispering words in a tongue no one living could recognize. At each pause in his murmur, those circling would press closer together, shoulders brushing, chest nearly touching. The heat of their bodies gathered in the cool night air, carrying with it the scent of sweat, crushed herbs, and something darker, an undercurrent of anticipation that made the skin prickle. One of the women broke from the circle. She stepped toward the central pillar, the one carved with the headless figure whose arms encircled its own belly. Her fingers traced the grooves of its stone hands, then lifted to press against the navel-like hollow carved into its surface. She bent her head close, her lips moving, though whatever she said was lost beneath the drum. The tall figure straightened. His eyes scanned the circle, settling on a man near the back, older, his beard streaked with gray, his body lean but marked by years of labor. The older man did not move at first, but when the figure beckoned with one sharp motion of the hand, he stepped forward. The circle parted to let him through. The young man, with the cord of bones, tightened his grip. His gaze followed the older man's every step until he reached the center. Something in his posture shifted, a tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, and for a moment it was unclear if he was watching with reverence or with resentment. Around them the rhythm quickened. The hands on the log struck faster, the drum beats closing the space between each thud until they were almost continuous. Torches sputtered as the air stirred with movement, and the shadows of foxes and vultures seemed to dance wildly along the walls. The tall figure reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew a small object, a carved stone, pale as bone, shaped into something that was neither animal nor human, but a merging of both. He held it up, and the circle froze. The older man reached out, his hands trembling slightly as they closed over the object. The moment his skin touched it, the drumming stopped. Silence filled the ring, heavy and absolute. In that pause, the sound of breathing became the loudest thing in the night. The older man's breath came fast, uneven, as he turned the stone in his hands. His eyes flicked upward toward the line of stars visible above the walls, as if seeking something there. A sudden cry shattered the stillness. It came from the shadows beyond the ring, high, sharp, and human. Every head turned toward the sound, but the darkness beyond the torches revealed nothing. The older man's grip tightened on the stone, his knuckles pale, and in the silence that followed, the tall figure's voice cut through like a blade. Bring them in. The circle shifted. Two of the cloaked figures broke away, vanishing into the gap between pillars where the cry had come from. Moments later, they returned, and between them was a figure whose head hung low, hair tangled and face hidden. Bare feet dragged across the dust. A thin rope bound their wrists in front, and as they were led into the torchlight, the red patterns painted on their skin gleamed like fresh wounds. The young man with the bone cord stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the bound figure. The carved stone in the older man's hands seemed to pulse in the light, each flicker of flame making it shift from ivory to shadow and back again. Somewhere above, an owl called. Once, twice, then silence. And in that silence, it became clear. Whatever was about to happen would mark the point where this night could not return to what it had been. The bound figure was led into the circle, their steps halting, as if the earth itself resisted each movement forward. The rope at their wrists pulled tight, the fibers rough against the skin, and they flinched as the light of the torches caught their face. The eyes were closed, lids trembling, lips pressed together as though holding back words or prayers. Painted spirals covered their shoulders, curling down over ribs and hips, each line traced with a steady hand by someone who knew the patterns by memory. The tall figure stepped closer. His shadow fell over the bound form, swallowing them in darkness. For a long moment, he said nothing, just circled slowly, his hand trailing through the air, not touching but passing close enough that the other could feel the heat of his palm. The drum began again, softer now, almost a whisper of rhythm, a heartbeat under the skin. Around them, the others formed a wider ring. They had stopped their pacing, their eyes fixed on the center, but their bodies moved still. A sway of the shoulders, a tilt of the head, an instinctive shift in time with the drum. The air thickened with the scent of crushed herbs burning in shallow stone bowls along the edges. Smoke curled upward in delicate strands, catching in the torchlight, drifting between the carved pillars like ghosts. The tall figure reached to the older man who still held the carved stone. Without a word, the man offered it, and the tall figure placed it against the bound one's chest, pressing lightly. The bound figure inhaled sharply, the paint on their skin catching the flicker of flame like living veins. Slowly, the tall figure traced the stone along the lines of paint, following the spirals down over ribs and around to the small of the back. It was not an act meant for speed. Each movement was deliberate, drawn out to the length of a breath, as if each touch sealed an invisible pact between the living and something unseen beyond the walls. The bound figure's breathing quickened, not entirely from fear. The others leaned closer without stepping forward, their eyes reflecting the light like those of the foxes and vultures etched in stone. The young man with the cord of bones moved at last, stepping into the space beside the tall figure. He lifted the cord, letting the small bones click softly, the sound sharp in the stillness. He began to move around the bound figure, letting the bones graze bare skin, leaving faint trails of gooseflesh in their wake. Each pass was met with a subtle shiver, a shift of weight from one foot to the other. The older man knelt at the bound figure's feet. In his hands was a shallow bowl filled with the dark liquid brought earlier. The smell was strong now, fermented grain mixed with honey, thick and sweet. He dipped his fingers into it, then brushed them over the tops of the bound figure's feet, marking them with two curved lines that met at the heel. He spoke low, his voice a murmur in a language that rolled like stones in water. One by one, others approached, Each brought something: a strip of hide, a length of woven grass, a fragment of animal horn, and placed it at the bound figure's feet before stepping back into the circle. The offerings formed a small pile, symbols whose meaning only those present could understand. The drum beats deepened, vibrating in the ribs. The torches flared, if stirred by a sudden breath of wind, though no wind moved. The tall figure placed his hand on the bound figure's head, pressing down gently until they knelt. He spoke now, words carrying in a steady rhythm, each phrase answered by a soft hum from those in the ring. The hum was not a melody but a vibration, a sound that seemed to sink into the stones itself. The bound figure lifted their head, eyes opened at last, not wide but steady, meeting the gaze of the tall figure without flinching. Something passed between them in that moment, silent but undeniable. The tall figure extended his hand, palm upward, and the bound figure placed theirs upon it. The rope slipped from their wrists, falling into the dust. The hum swelled. The ring of onlookers began to move again, closing in slowly until they formed a tight circle around the pair in the center. The space narrowed, heat building as bodies pressed closer, the air thick with the scent of sweat, smoke, and fermented drink. Then came the first shift, the twist that pulled the night into something unexpected. From the far side of the ring, a figure stepped forward unbidden. They were draped in the hide of a leopard, the spotted fur dull in the torchlight, the head of the animal hanging over their chest. In their hand was a flint blade, its edge chipped fine and sharp. They did not move toward the bound figure, but toward the central pillar itself. Without a word, they pressed the blade against the pillar's carved surface and began to scrape, removing a thin curl of stone. The sound was harsh, grating against the low hum. The tall figure's head turned sharply, but he did not move to stop them. Instead, he stepped back, allowing the scraping to continue. When the curl of stone broke free, the leopard-cloaked figure held it up, turning it in their hand before walking to the bound figure. They pressed it into the spiral-painted skin just above the heart and held it there. The hum stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute. A single drop of the dark liquid from the bowl was poured over the stone fragment where it touched the skin. It ran down in a slow line, catching the torchlight like molten bronze. The bound figure closed their eyes again, tilting their head back as if in offering. What followed was neither hurried nor hidden. Movements became deliberate exchanges, touches and gestures that wove together the physical and the symbolic. Each act mirrored the carvings on the pillars, intertwined figures, mirrored postures, the joining of hands and faces in ways that blurred the line between worship and union. The participants moved in and out of the circle center, each taking a moment to connect with the bound figure, to leave their own mark. A line of pigment, a pressed palm, a whispered word, before returning to the ring. The tall figure remained close, guiding each interaction, ensuring that the rhythm never broke. The drumbeat slowed again, matching the pace of breath, as if binding the living to the ancient stone and the unseen forces it represented. At the midpoint of the rite, the older man stepped forward once more, lifting the carved stone high. The hum returned, louder now, joined by a faint wailing note from a bone flute. The sound spiraled upward, curling into the dark sky. The bound figure rose to their feet, the spiral patterns on their body now streaked and smudged, the marks of the knight's axe visible in the shifting colors of pigment and sweat. The tall figure turned toward the central pillar, pressing the carved stone into its surface until it fit into a hollow, worn smooth by generations. As it slid into place, the hum broke into a chant, rhythmic, rising, echoing against the stone walls. The chant carried the rite toward its close, but the air held a different kind of tension now. The leopard-cloaked figure had not returned to the ring. They stood at the far edge, their eyes fixed on the bound figure with an intensity that cut through the ritual's unity. In one slow movement, they lifted the flint blade again, not toward the pillar this time, but toward their own arm. With a single, swift motion, they drew the blade across the skin, letting blood fall into the dust. The chant faltered for a heartbeat, then surged louder, as if the act had fed it. The bound figure stepped forward, kneeling to press their hand into the blood-stained earth, leaving a dark print that would vanish into the soil by morning. The tall figure's voice rose above the chant, steady and final. Whatever was spoken could not be translated, but its weight was felt. The rite was complete, yet the way the leopard-cloaked figure watched the bound one suggested something had been altered. A balance shifted. The torches guttered as if in acknowledgement. One by one, they were extinguished, until only the pale starlight remained. The carved animals on the pillars faded into shadow, their watch over the night ending as silently as it had begun. No one spoke as they left the ring. The bound figure walked unassisted now, their head high, but the spiral patterns on their skin seemed changed. Less like paint, more like marks burned into memory. And somewhere in the dark, the sound of the drum continued alone, fading only when the first rays of dawn touched the hill. The hill was quiet when morning came. The wind that had been still through the night now moved in low sweeps, stirring the dust and bending the tall grasses at the edges of the ridge. Pale light touched the tops of the limestone pillars, turning them the color of old bone. The scent of smoke lingered, clinging to the stones, mingled with the faint trace of the herbs burned during the rite. Those who had gathered in the circle were gone. No voices, no footsteps, only the slow settling of the earth where their bodies had pressed against it. A few strands of braided grass lay tangled at the base of one pillar. A smear of ochre marked another, still vivid despite the night's chill. The offerings, the strips of hide, the horn fragments, the woven cords had been taken. Nothing remained that would speak plainly of what had happened. The bound figure, no longer bound, sat just beyond the circle, their back to the stones. Their eyes were half-lidded, fixed on some point in the distance. The spiral patterns on their skin were faded, blurred into something that looked almost natural, as though the paint had sunk into the flesh. They did not move when the tall figure approached. He crouched beside them, his hand resting lightly on the ground between them rather than on their body. His eyes were unreadable, neither triumph nor concern in them. Only the stillness of someone who has seen the end of one thread and the start of another. A short exchange passed between them. No more than a handful of words, the kind that carried more weight in tone than in meaning. The bound figure nodded once, slow, before rising and walking toward the far slope of the hill. Not everyone was pleased with the night's ending. On the opposite side of the circle, the leopard-cloaked figure stood in the shadows of the pillars watching. The flint blade was gone from their hand, but the cut on their arm had dried to a dark line. Their eyes followed the departing figure until the slope hid them from view. Only then did they step into the open, their gaze meeting the tall figures across the space between pillars. It was not a greeting. It was a challenge, silent and unfinished. By midday, the ridge was empty. The only movement came from vultures circling far above, their shadows sliding over the stones. But traces of the gathering remained, hidden from the casual eye. A shallow groove in the earth where the drum had been placed. Ash cooled into white flakes that scattered at the lightest touch. The faint outline of a handprint pressed into the soil, the one made in blood during the rite, already fading under the wind. For those who had taken part, the rite was more than ceremony. It was a reaffirmation of the bond between the living and the forces they served, a way to ensure the continued favor of whatever power they believed resided in the stone rings. But among the inner circle, the leaders, the ones who directed the rites, the night had introduced a fracture. The leopard-cloaked figure's unsanctioned act had shifted the balance, and though nothing was spoken, the air carried the weight of an unspoken reckoning. In the days that followed, small signs of change appeared. When the hunters returned from the plains, they brought not only meat but skins in greater number, as if preparing for a season of intensified rituals. The carved pillars in one of the smaller enclosures were repainted with fresh pigment, deeper reds, sharper blacks, as though the animals themselves needed to be made more vivid. And then there were the whispers. Among those who had not been chosen to stand in the inner ring that night, the story took on edges it had not possessed in the moment. Some spoke of the bound figure as having crossed into a state beyond the living, a state they could not name but which left them marked for the rest of their days. Others claimed the leopard cloaked figure had been sent by forces outside the temple, that the blood they shed was meant to call something else into the circle, something that did not answer to the tall figure or the rites of the hill. The tall figure said nothing publicly. He moved among the workers carving new pillars, among the hunters preparing offerings, as though the night had left him unchanged. But those closest to him noticed the subtle alterations. The way his gaze lingered longer on the leopard-cloaked figure when they crossed paths. The way he traced his fingers over the hollow in the central pillar where the carved stone now sat, as if feeling for something missing. Far from the hill, in the lowlands where other bands of people followed their own seasonal rhythms, the stories travel. Gobekli Tepe was known as a place of power even to those who had never seen it, and each new tale only deepened its mystery. In some versions, the bound figure was a willing offering, chosen for their purity or their connection to the unseen. In others, they were taken against their will, their role forced upon them as part of an older debt. No version was entirely true, but all contained pieces of what had happened. What none of them carried was the moment that had shifted the rite, the scraping of the pillar, the flint blade, the blood in the dust, that remained within the circle of those who had been there, unspoken but remembered. Seasons turned. The gatherings at the hill continued, each one building upon the last. But the memory of that night lingered in the way the participants moved, in the glances traded between the tall figure and the leopard-cloaked one, in the careful watch kept over the bound figure whenever they appeared on the ridge. The rite had not been repeated in exactly the same form, but certain gestures, the spiral paint, the carved stone pressed to the chest, began to appear more often, as if the core of that night had bled into the others. And always the central pillar bore the faint mark where the flint blade had scraped away the surface. No pigment could hide it entirely. To those who knew, it was a reminder that even in a place built for ritual control, something could happen that shifted the course of the hill story. By the time the next great gathering came, the bound figure of that night had become something else in the eyes of the people. A living link to the unseen, one who had passed through the most forbidden of acts and returned. Some approached them with reverence, others with unease, but none ignored them. And in the center of the temple, beneath the carved foxes and vultures, the tall figure watched, waiting for the moment when the balance would tip again. Night returned to the hill, as it always did. The wind fell away, leaving the air so still the torches burned without flicker. Shadows crept once more along the carved pillars, stretching the foxes and serpents until they seemed to writhe in the firelight. The smell of dust and old smoke lingered, the ground holding the memory of steps taken long ago and of those taken just nights before. Near the central pillar, the hollow where the carved stone rested was warm to the touch, though no hand had been near it for hours. The tall figure stood in the ring alone, his eyes on the gap between two pillars where the bound figure had first entered. The space was empty now, but the air there felt different, thicker, charged, as though it still held the shape of a body. The moon rose high, casting its pale light across the ridge. In that light, The scrape left by the leopard-cloaked figure's flint blade glimmered faintly, a thin scar across the otherwise smooth surface of the stone. It was not deep, but it was permanent. From the slopes below, a sound drifted up, the faint rhythm of a drum, so distant it could have been mistaken for the heartbeat in one's own chest. The tall figure tilted his head to listen, his expression unreadable. No gathering had been called for this night. No torches burned on the paths. And yet the drumbeat came, slow, steady, carrying on the wind until it faded into silence. He stepped away from the pillar, his hand brushing the carved fox, whose eyes caught the torchlight like molten gold. For a moment, it seemed to watch him in return. Then the torch sputtered, the light broke, and the fox was just stone again. Far below, where the grass swayed in the moonlight, a lone figure walked the ridge's edge. The spiral patterns on their skin were gone, washed clean, but in the pale glow, their silhouette was unmistakable. They did not look back toward the temple. Their steps were unhurried, as if they knew the hill would always be waiting. In the ring, the tall figure's gaze followed them until the night swallowed their shape. His eyes then moved to the leopard-cloaked figure who stood at the far side of the circle, half hidden in shadow. No words passed between them. None were needed. The wind returned in a sudden whisper, carrying with it the smell of the herbs burned during the rite. It wrapped around the pillars, curled through the open spaces, and vanished into the darkness beyond. The torches burned lower. The stone animals faded into silhouettes. The drumbeat did not return. Only the silence remained, deep and patient, as if the hill itself were holding its breath. Somewhere, far from this place, the stories would be told again. Of the temple on the hill, of the carvings that watched, of the night when the oldest rite was performed and something within it changed. None of the tellers would agree on the ending. Some would say the spirits were appeased, others that they were angered. But the hill would keep its own version, and it would wait, as it always had, for the next night when the torches burned and the circle closed it, and the question left unanswered at the dawn of the world was asked again.